In a recent Catholic League article online from Bill Donahue, he's the president, he's making a comment about the most recent high school shootings. And I'll just read some of the comments. The news media and pundits are wading through another fog, trying to figure out why the latest serial killer went on a rampage. As a sociologist, referring to himself, who has written on the subject before, I can attest that the serial killers have much in common, especially young killers. So what do we know about, I can't pronounce his last name, Demetrius? Well, besides his affection for communism and Nazism, he was known as a weird loner by his classmates. As one person reflected after the fact, a classmate, he stuck to himself. He had very few friends and never really talked to many people. He also loved playing video games, listening to heavy metal. About his father, didn't see him very often. Dad was overseas working in maritime business. And other symbols of someone who's living more and more into the kingdom of darkness. Bill also notes he was an atheist. Why am I saying this? This young man tortured and did a horrible thing. He kills himself too. Was isolated. No meaningful relationships. Nothing to nourish his soul. Nothing to let him know he was cherished and loved so he could love. That's an extreme example of what happens when we don't have meaningful relationships in our lives. Dramatic and extreme, but it makes the point. And this is Trinity Sunday. We need relationships. Why? Because that's how our God is. Divine persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. We, in our humble effort to understand the Trinity, which is about that much of understanding the Trinity, the rest is infinity, the Father loves the Son, and the Son loves the Father, an intimate, infinite exchange of love and intimacy, and that is so intense, it is the person of the Trinity, of the Spirit. Three divine persons, one God. So our God is a community of love, which fashioned all that is. And you and I are made in the image of God, aren't we? Image and likeness, it says in Genesis. So if we're to image God and be like God, because that's who we are, that's our identity and our destiny, we have to be in meaningful relationships. And we can go on to how do we get to the Trinity? Well, we won't go too long, but first reading their Father Chuck Gallagher, who helped establish Marriage Encounter in our country in 1968, 50 years anniversary this year, would say on a parish renewal weekend, which was held here many years ago, several times, the Jewish faith has given us many things, but especially two, monotheism and Mary. Okay, so the Jewish insight that broke through the world religions, God is one. Now, then we hear in Paul, in the second reading, he's talking about the Father, and he's the Son, and there's the Spirit. Whoops, getting complicated. And then the gospel, go forth, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, Father, Son, and Spirit. So you can imagine the early church figuring out, what is this all about? One God's pretty simple. God. Now we have three persons, three gods. And so this early church struggled with that, but affirmed, finally, no, one God, three divine persons, a community of love. So, and God did something amazing. When you fall in love, let's start that process. Okay, you're testing the waters, and as it grows, and you get more in touch with you like to, and you're beginning to trust this person. What happens? You begin to let down your guard and share more of yourself. Maybe even risking being misunderstood or whatever, but you begin to share more. the term we tend to use is we risk becoming vulnerable. So that becoming open to or transparent to another also comes from the fact we're in God's image. What has God just told us? Now, it's transparent to the extent that our limited minds can understand. God's saying, here is my inner life. I'm showing you who I am. And he's taking a big risk because we can say, that's nice, and sin and walk away. And reject God. When we sin, we reject God. Hopefully not a final rejection, which is problematic, obviously. And so that's part of why we need relationship, because that's how we flourish as human beings. It's the only way. Without life-giving relationships, family, friends, spouse, whatever that rich network can be, we wither. Demetrius withered. His soul, and metaphorically, died, because souls can't die. But the Son of God that he is was lost. And unfortunately, people noted his weird behavior, wearing a trench coat and heavy boots, and the kids knew he was into heavy metal. There were many warning signs. And yet, he was left alone in isolation. And again, that's a tragic, extreme example. But we look around and, the violence in our nation, kids who don't have that nurturing relationship with mom and dad and an environment of love, poor performance in school, early dropout rate, high incidence of drug abuse, greater incidence of incarceration. We find that relationships are hard to sustain, but the effects of relationship poor life, insufficient attention to the development of healthy, life-giving relationships lead to what? Loneliness, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, addictions, depression, divorce, broken homes. So we see the effect of what happens when relationships are wounded and hurt. That's a whole other direction to go, but because we're made in the image of God, we cannot thrive as a person or as a community without relationships that nurture. That's why God sent his Son. That's why the Father sent the Son. So we could be restored and healed. Now, there are many things to do about that, but I'm sort of putting my homily together on the fly here because we're getting this morning at 1 o'clock a.m. after a wonderful conference in Florida on priest conference on Unbound. You'll hear more about that later. But so, because there's other thoughts. So there are ways to improve and work on relationship. The first one, with God. When we start getting that right with God, things begin to happen. So, if I'm beginning to pray, and prayer is a relationship with God. If I'm working on my relationship with God, not just saying prayers, but working on my relationship, I begin to change. I begin to notice things about myself. Obvious selfishness, subtle selfishness. Oh, prayer, intimacy with God, grants me the grace to change and say, I got to do something about that. If I begin to change, getting rid of those things that hurt others, that means I can love others better. That's good, right? Prayer helps me see another person differently. Helps me realize that that person's beloved of God as I am. That changes how I begin to choose to relate to them. Prayer does many things, But it is a foundational point because it's what? Relationship. The primary one's God, all the rest follow. So that's one of the ways we begin to undo the damage of vulnerable relationships. Repent, confess our sinfulness, seek forgiveness and reconciliation. Yes, absolutely. But prayer becomes the source of the desire to do that, the courage to do that, and the grace to do that. So it's Trinity Sunday. So here's some homework. Let's honor our God, three divine persons in one. And this week, let's just you and I look at our relationships. At home, in the parish, with friends, colleagues at work, classmates, even though school's over for a while, classmates, etc. Those important people in our lives. And say, which one needs attention? Do I need to ask forgiveness? Do I need to extend forgiveness? Is there someone with whom my busyness has kept me out of touch with them that really need my attention? Think of spouse or kids. And how am I doing with God? The primary relationship, which nourishes and blesses all other relationships. My sisters and brothers, when our relationships flourish, which is the work of grace in ourselves and God, through God, we flourish. There'll be less and less Demetriuses in the world.